Hello and welcome back, everybody. So we're out here next to one of my all-time favorite figs in the world, the Peter's honey fig. Not only is it an easy variety to grow, but it's absolutely beautiful in the landscape and an abundant, prolific grower. Now, because the fig tree is deciduous, it's going to drop and lose all its leaves come the first frost or freeze into your area. And you can see that's where we're at now. We've got nothing but wood here on this tree. And you can see the bird bath here. Got cold last night. But it's when the fig tree goes dormant like this, so anytime between November and February, before the tree begins to flush out new growth, that you want to take cuttings if you want to propagate clones of whatever fig tree it is that you're growing that you want to propagate more of. Well, just like as with most plants that you take cuttings from, you can take a whole branch like this, and as long as you have some growth nodes on here, you can turn that into a cutting. So if we were to cut, let's say, this whole little side branch off right here, we could turn this into 2-3 cuttings. But here's where the tip comes in that you need to pay special attention to. And that is this: the fig will lose the moisture in the wood very easily. If you take a cutting that has a fresh cut on either end, that piece of wood is going to lose moisture rapidly, and it's going to be much harder to root. That's why, especially for the backyard grower, if you're looking to just grow a few extra trees, maybe to sell, give away, what have you, then I recommend taking what's known as a tip cutting. So right here would be a perfect example. We've got a sealed tip on this end with some fresh growth that's going to emerge. So if we take our cutting here, as long as we have the cutting stuck down into some soil or some sand, which is my favorite medium to root figs, then you're not going to lose a lot of moisture and you're going to have great success propagating your figs that way. So as you can see on this tree, we've got a lot of tips that we can take cuttings from, but you don't just want to randomly take cuts off your tree or you're going to deform its overall structure. So what I'm looking to do is thin out some of the inward growth that's heading into the tree and develop a more vase-shaped structure on the fig tree, similar to what we do with many of the stone fruits. So take out some of that center growth. It's going to allow for more sun penetration into the center of the tree, airflow. So here's a prime candidate. We've got a branch growing right into the center of the tree here. I'm going to go ahead and take the whole thing out. So I'm going to cut it right here where it's beginning its growth off of the main branch. Just that one branch that we just pruned could produce 3 or 4 cuttings. But for myself, since I just want to propagate a few of these trees, I'm just going to focus on collecting some tip cuttings. So I'm going to actually make this about 12 inches long, and I'm going to make a cut just below a growth node, like so. And this is the perfect style cutting when propagating figs for the backyard grower. The cut end here is going to be stuck down into your growing medium, so it's not going to lose all that moisture. It's going to be taking up moisture. And because we don't have any fresh cuts up top, it's not going to be losing any moisture through the top of the cutting. So for most people, you're almost guaranteed success doing it this way. You're not going to have to create a humidity dome for your fig cuttings, and you're not going to have to baby them too much. Just stick them on in some potting soil or sand and give it about 8 months before you dig them up, and you should have a good root development. So with that being said, let's say you do want to maximize how many cuttings you can get off your tree. Perhaps you want to send them to a friend or family, or you want to store them long term, which you can do in the refrigerator if you follow the next step that I'm going to be sharing with you. If you have cuttings that have a fresh cut on both ends, then you're going to want to actually seal the top portion of the cutting with some wax, just some simple candle wax. I found these little tea light candles are the perfect option. They come in a little metal container, so you can easily melt these down on your glass top stove. What I did is I removed about half of the candle, just so that when it melts, it doesn't overflow onto the glass top. So for now, we can just set this aside, and if we need some more wax, we can add it into this little metal container here. But any candle will work. I'd recommend using an unscented candle. Here's one that was, 50 cents. It's broken. So we could use this for some upcoming sealing if need be. All right, so once you got your candle melted down, all you need to do is take it off the heat. You don't want it super hot, just hot enough to where you can take the top of your cutting, the tip that's been cut, dip it in the wax, And that right there, my friends, is going to essentially seal the top, seal the moisture into the cutting. And hopefully it comes through on the camera, but we do have a complete wax seal now on the tip of this cutting. So now you're able to go ahead and plant this into your soil medium, and all the moisture is not going to come out the top of the cuttings, which is great because now we can just stick these cuttings like normal. We don't have to be overly concerned with humidity, keeping a humidity dome over the cuttings in order to keep them from drying out. Now that the wax is cooling down a little bit, it's drying up quickly. Now let's say I wanted to send this cutting to a friend. In that case, I would seal both ends like so, and I would make a mark on the cutting identifying the top from the bottom, just so there's no confusion in the future. And then when my friend receives the cutting, he would just cut off the bottom portion with the wax and stick this, leaving the wax on the top, again keeping that moisture in. He'd be good to go. Waxing both ends will also allow you to store these long term. You can put them in the crisper drawer of your refrigerator, wrap them in a moist paper towel, put them in a Ziploc, and you can keep them in there for several months, up to a year, and they will remain viable that way. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Just keep these on tap. Maybe I'll have a guest come over, or I head out somewhere where I can gift these to somebody. They'll be ready to go. So one of the keys to fig tree pruning for me is to manage the height. So I just like to reach up, see how high I can reach, and cut off anything that is above that level, because it's going to grow another 2 feet over the next growing season. And so I don't want the tree getting way too tall where I have to get up on a ladder to harvest all the fruit. So when I'm taking some of the height off the tree, what I'm looking to do is make a cut after an outward facing node, because I want any new growth that occurs here to shoot outward, not inward to the tree. So you can see here on this branch, we've got an outward facing node right here. So I'm going to make my cut just above that node. And here's another great example where I'm about to make a height cut. But rather than cut up here, I'm just going to cut right above this outward facing branch. And that cut right here is an absolutely perfect cutting. It's about 1 foot long. There's more than a dozen nodes on here. We've got a complete tip or top on the cutting. And all we need to do, again, is stick this in a growing medium, keep it slightly moist, and come 8 months from now, we're going to have ourselves a new rooted fig tree. All right, so in just about 5 minutes, I've now completely pruned this tree to the proper height, took out some of that dense center growth, left a little bit there, and now we have all those prunings that we can turn into cuttings. Let's go do that. All right, so we're in the greenhouse now. We're gonna get some of these cuttings started, propagated. It's really not necessary that you have a greenhouse with the fig cuttings. You can just stick your cuttings into your growing medium. For me, my favorite choice is play sand or construction sand, sand that has been washed. But whether it's sand or potting mix, you could leave this outside. I'd suggest doing so next to maybe a wall of your house or a fence, out of direct sunlight. Again, it's going to be about 8 months before you have a usable cutting that's now rooted and become a tree that you can now plant. You can just stick that down into some sand, and because this is a shallow container, I like to go at a slight angle. Make sure it's at least a couple inches down, and that's all there is to it. You really don't need any rooting hormone or anything special to propagate figs. With that being said, I'm also going to stick some of these cuttings using a bit of rooting hormone. This is Clonex. This is a rooting gel. A little bit expensive. As I said, not necessary. But when you use something like this, you're going to increase your overall success rate, as well as perhaps create a more vigorous root system and more foliage growth over the course of the 8 months. So we'll take our next cutting here, and I'm just going to shorten it just a little bit. And we'll just take this, dip it in a bit of rooting hormone. Then you can use a dibber or your finger. Just make a little hole there so that you don't rub off all of the rooting hormone. Stick your cutting, but it's nice to start off with a pre-moistened medium. That way you're not having to water all these cuttings in after you stick them, which will also rinse off a lot of that rooting hormone. By the way, this container I'm using is just a dish pan that I bought at the dollar store. And the way I set these up is I put 2 or 3 holes in the bottom, as you can see. And you can use a drill or a soldering iron. I prefer a soldering iron. Just heat it up. You can poke through really quick. And then you can just get yourself a piece of screen like this. Lay it on the bottom over the holes. I used to tape them down, but I found it's not necessary. Once you put the sand in, it weights it down in place, and that's going to prevent the sand from falling out the bottom like an hourglass. But you could even double up your piece of screen, offset it a little bit, which will give you even smaller holes for that sand to possibly fall out of. But this works wonderfully. And because we're just rooting these cuttings, we can plant these rather close together right now. Later on, it'll be easy to separate the roots that may grow into each other when it comes time to up pot these when we do have root development. And that's all there is to it. In just a few minutes, we have now successfully propagated over a dozen cuttings that will eventually turn into new trees.